Here we go. And welcome to Tech for Good, the Las Vegas chapter. I'm so happy to be here on this third Tuesday of the month that we meet every month, the third Tuesday at 7:30 in the morning. We'd like to do these early mornings so you can get in there and get all of this information and then go off for your day. These days have been a little bit different. And as you've probably seen, technology has exploded because that is the only way we can reach the outside world for now going on, well, a little bit over 2 months. So Tech for Good really is here to serve the nonprofit sector. And our goal is to bring not only the nonprofits in to learn about these resources, but to also have the providers, those techies, those technology companies to come in and give some of the information and share some of the information that they have. Here I am slapping and pulling my plugs out of my ear. That's technology for you. I'm so used to standing in front of the classroom or in front of a presentation and using my hands. I have to get used to the new small screen format. So, okay. But I'm exceptionally excited to have our guest today all the way here from Houston, Texas. And that is one of the values of technology now. All of these different conferencing platforms, you've heard of GoToWebinar and GoToMeetings and WebEx. Zoom has literally zoomed and run to the top of the list of being one of those platforms, but it is making access to experts in their field, those professionals, the industry leaders, available to anyone across the country. And we are excited to have Miss Erin McClarty, Esquire. Yes, she's an attorney from Houston, Texas. I met Erin several years ago. Don't really remember exactly how we met, but she did come to Las Vegas to participate in one of the Philanthropreneur Foundation's first conferences that we had here. We're now going on our 6th year. That those conferences will be transitioning to virtual, but the Philanthropreneur Foundation is the sponsor of Tech for Good Las Vegas chapter as a part of NetSquare and TechSoup. So I am now going to turn it over to Erin. Everybody give her a big round of applause. I know I'm overdoing this, but I'm so excited, and welcome, Erin. And please give us a little bit more of your background and then dive right into your presentation of technology in the legal world and nonprofits.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. It's been interesting since we first met. It's definitely evolved. And so a lot of my practice or work then was practicing law, and I still practice law. It's evolved more into being a social impact architect is what I call that. So
love that term. Love
thank you. It fits the work better because truly people come in with ideas of positive impact that they want to have. Very similar to what I saw when I went to your conference. You have a lot of people with great ideas that want to change the world, but aren't sure how to do it, what the resources are, or maybe they have an existing business, but they want the business to be far more impactful than it is. So then we truly construct a blueprint of what that looks like and then actually construct what it is through the legal channels of creating entities and structures and community engagement and things like that. So it's been a lot of fun. As you can imagine, technology has definitely come up for a lot of the clients. So I was excited to pull this out. I did give this similar talk to Houston and have updated it just for you all to talk about a lot of the issues that come up with nonprofits specifically when they're using technology and things to be thinking about. So what I'll do is share my screen.
Okay.
And we'll see if this works.
There you go. Yes, you did. All right.
All right, perfect. And all right. Does that fill up the screen?
Yes, it did. It's perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right. So as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about technology when it comes to nonprofit organizations specifically. things to be thinking about in their day-to-day, things to be thinking about as they start new projects, programs, and initiatives. It's not necessarily COVID specific. That was something you and I, Victoria, talked about. Was a lot of this has just been the case for a really long time,
Yeah.
but it's coming to the forefront for many organizations as they're being forced to, or gently guided to evolve into a more technologically adept organization. So some of this may seem fairly day to day. It's because it is. It's just a lot of nonprofits weren't doing or thinking about it before and have to be thinking about it way more now. So I talked about myself a little bit. I won't cover that. Just quickly, what I want to talk about are big picture topics. So privacy, security, intellectual property, other big picture concerns, and then workarounds with all of this. And the way that I'll talk about it, because I think it makes it easier, is to mention triggers. So one of the things I don't like to do is to talk specifically about just the solution and the thing to be thinking about, because the facts change depending on who and what the organization is. And for me, the best thing for organizations to be doing is thinking about what circumstances come up where I need to say, you know what, I remember hearing about this. What are the potential issues with this? So when I start working on a new Winky page or website for a project, or a microsite for a project, oh, you know what, I remember when I'm creating sites, potential issues could be privacy, intellectual property, and data collection or something like that. Oh, I remember that when I'm on Zoom, these are things that can come up. So it's much easier to have that benchmark event, that thing that can trigger us and say, oh, I may not know what specific issues I have right now, but I know that when I'm in this territory, these are things that I need to be thinking about. And then I'll talk about concerns, how it can come up, and workarounds around that. So the intent is not to make anyone a legal expert. I always make this disclaimer because people come to these things fully expecting that they will come out knowing all the laws, all the circumstances, all the potential issues. Again, that's one, that's not possible. I don't, most attorneys don't, but two, that's not the intent. The intent is, again, to get that light bulb moment so you can say, oh, I do need to go reach out to X, or I need to reach out to Y, and really start to use those delegation muscles. So if you walk away from this more confused than you were walking in, that is typical. All that means is that it's gotten your wheels turning, and there's probably situations that you're thinking about already in which these things have come up, in which case you might want to talk to an attorney or some type of consultant or expert around your specific issues to see if there are things that you need to be putting into place. And then I think most people know what a 501c3 is, but I like to cover this because there is this unspoken belief amongst many of the clients I work with and many of the nonprofits I run into, that because they're doing good, they will be forgiven if they just forget or don't look into something. So we don't know the law, we don't look into the law, something happens, we were doing something good, they'll probably let it slide. And in some instances, in some states, in some circumstances, that can be true. There may be a little bit more leniency. However, with everything that's going on, we just talked about the Zoom bombings, and as hacking and things become more and more serious, agencies are becoming more and more serious about their enforcement. You also have to keep in mind, this is I don't like to say political issue because I think everything is a political issue, but it's absolutely a political issue, because anything like this that comes up around people's privacy, their computers, their data in an election year is almost always handled more heavily than it would in any other year. If you look back and see enforcement actions against some of the biggies when there's been hackings, you may see that the penalties and the media coverage has been a little bit heavier when you have politicians that find out and get involved, legislators that find out and get involved, that want to make examples of those organizations to show that they are serious about cracking down on hacking and things like that. So I say all that to say, remember, the 501c3 is merely an exemption, and the nonprofit is merely the type of business entity. But at the end of the day, every 501c3 is a business entity. And so every business entity has an obligation to understand the technology that it's using, how it's using that technology, the risks of using that technology, and then actually taking the actions to mitigate the risks of that technology. And I think you will start to see, especially because I don't have the statistic in front of me, but the increasing amount of hacking is happening with nonprofits because they don't have the right protocols in place. It was something like 70%, I think, last year when you talked about small, mid-sized to small, was with nonprofit sites that had donation portals, especially, or were accepting money online because they usually didn't have the appropriate protocols in place to protect themselves. So they've become targets for the very reason that they're doing something positive, and so are more likely to be bringing in money than some of the other sites. And as a result, need to make sure that they protect themselves. So privacy, and I have notes just to make sure that I don't drone on if you see me looking off to the side. As I mentioned, the right to privacy is something that's becoming more and more regulated. It's something that people are paying more and more attention to. And what makes it tricky is that it's regulated on several different fronts. So it's regulated on the state level, it's regulated on the federal level, and it's regulated on the international level. And a lot of people don't know that. So as you're collecting information, when I talk about privacy, this is what I'm talking about: collecting any type of information, especially personally identifying and sensitive information. And keeping in mind, not only are there different levels of the agencies that are regulating these things, there's different laws depending on the type of information. So with health information, I think a lot of us have already heard about HIPAA, and there's very specific privacy requirements around HIPAA. If it's financial information, there's very specific privacy requirements around the Graham-Leach Act. And so one of the things that you have to be thinking about as you're collecting data is, who are the regulating agencies that I need to be thinking about? You'll likely need to be thinking about the states. And something about that, not only the state in which you and your organization are housed or domiciled, but the states of the individuals for whom you're collecting information. So states like California, Massachusetts have what they call long arm statutes. It's truly exactly how it sounds: a long arm that reaches out to you and snatches you back into the law of that specific state. Why does that matter? California has very specific privacy laws around how data can be collected, how it can be used, when it can be disclosed, how it needs to be thrown away or gotten rid of. And so if I'm collecting information from someone who's in California, not only do I need to be thinking about Texas's laws around that, which there are some, but I need to be thinking about Californian laws around that as well, because if something goes wrong, California law will kick in. The same is the case internationally. I think we've all heard about GDPR, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, but there are laws in France, there are laws in Germany that are very specific around the collection of personally identifying information. The right to be forgotten laws in the European Union, which basically means when I was a teen, I might have done something really stupid on YouTube that I don't really want on the internet for the rest of time. And so there are very specific right to be forgotten laws, i.e. having that content deleted throughout some of the European Union member states. So with privacy, looking at the data that you're collecting, it's really important to understand where is that data coming from, because that's going to help dictate and help you understand what you need to be thinking about and what does that data pertain to. Let's see. I think I covered everything. Keep information private, why it matters. When this comes up is newsletters, when people set up member accounts for those member organizations, those nonprofits that are member organizations, you may be asking for information. Payment processing, setting up donation portals, there's information that's asked for. And without skipping, one of the things you have to be thinking about here is, how much information do I actually need? And that's going to be one of the workarounds that I talk about is maybe the way to protect yourself is to not ask for so much information. But one of the things that you definitely want to be thinking about, because it's coming up more and more, and again, you're starting to see more enforcement action, both from states, the FTC and other federal agencies, as well as I've heard that there's been some enforcement of GDPR. I think they're looking for bigger fish, but who knows? And there's some pretty serious penalties for failing to comply with GDPR. For those who aren't familiar, it's a new regime around data collection, data management, and there's protocols that you have to have in place in terms of training people a certain amount of times a year. People have to be able to request information. You have it readily accessible to give to them. They can request that you delete certain information, and so there has to be protocols in place for that. That applies again to the European Union, and it is again a long arm statute, so it applies to people who are collecting information from those folks. So lots I just said there because it's a biggie, but the gist is, what data are you bringing in? And when I say data, that's really can be anything that you are collecting online. It can include cookies. If you have platforms that are tracking how people use their computers or what sites they're going to or their IP address, all of that is data. So it's really important that you know what kind of data that you're collecting, that you have a rationale for how you're collecting it, that you have processes in place for what you do, which actually is kind of leading into security. That you have processes in place for how you do collect that information and processes for what to do with the information once you've actually gotten it. So yeah, collecting sensitive or confidential information. This tends to go, security, a lot of people tend to think a little bit more about the credit card processing system. So again, when I'm collecting donations, doing some type of crowdfunding and things like that, or maybe I sell things to help support my nonprofit organization, so I have an e-commerce. What I'm thinking about more here with security is, as I mentioned, each state has its own laws around data collection and privacy, but they also will have security requirements in those laws. And so where security comes up is not only in how you're maintaining the data and whether you're using reasonable standards to keep it from being hacked, but there may also be specific requirements around what happens if it does get hacked. Again, California has laws around that, Massachusetts has laws, and not only does it talk about what needs to happen, but it gets really specific. How many days do you have to notify people? Do you have to have credit services that are monitoring their credit after a certain amount of time? What kind of damages and penalties are people entitled to if their credit does get compromised? What other provisions do you have to make? A lot of that is being governed at a state-by-state level. I didn't mention this before, but because it's become so tricky and there's so many different states with so many different laws, one of the things that I recommend to clients is, if you're using a MailChimp, if you're using any of these data email marketing sites, keep track of where information is coming from. So I would often work with clients and we'd see, we've got a lot of folks from California that are filling out these newsletter requests or purchasing or whatever. So a lot of data was being collected from California. That means I would advise the client that we look at Californian law, get really familiar with what it requires to make sure that they were at least meeting that standard. And then we may see that Washington State was another big one for them. And so we would look at Washington State. It's not to say that you shouldn't be following every state's laws, because as an attorney, I have to tell you that you should. However, again, this is risk mitigation. And knowing that a lot of nonprofits are lean and have smaller staff, smaller resources in terms of equipment and people, and sometimes finances, it all comes down to risk mitigation. So if a big portion of your risk is coming from very specific states, then start with those states and just get really familiar with what their requirements are to make sure that you're at least meeting those baseline requirements. And some states are known for being the pinnacle. So California often, is kind of up there in terms of its laws that it has in places. So if I meet California standards, I may be meeting several other states' standards as a result of that. But with security, anytime you're collecting sensitive information, you want to be thinking about, how am I keeping it? How is it being protected? What is my process if it no longer is protected, if it gets hacked? What do I have in place to keep it from being hacked? And if I'm using vendors, what do they have in place? Because some states also have very specific laws around your vendors. So where this comes up is, for example, let's say the host for my site, the host gets hacked. Does that mean people now have access to the information that I've collected on my site? This has actually happened a few times for payment processors, you may have seen, where the payment processors were the ones that got hacked. And so if I use that payment processor, some of my donors and funders and clients may have had their information compromised. What obligations do I have at that point then to notify people, and what am I responsible for on behalf of that payment processor or for that vendor? If you use a payment processor or vendor, please make sure you've read that agreement, because ironically, more often than not, they completely indemnify themselves against that liability, which means they say, hey, we're doing our best. We use industry standards. Sometimes they say that, sometimes they don't, but they say we're doing our best. If something happens, best of luck to you. We are not responsible for that. And I won't name names, but there are many large payment processors. If you look through their contract or their terms of use, you'll see they very specifically disclaim responsibility for hacking. Now, to what extent they can do that, that's to be decided by the law, but that's something that you want to know about, and you want to be familiar with what their processes are in the event that there is a hacking. So all of this kind of ties into security, maintaining that secrecy and making sure that you have access, ready access to information. See if I missed anything here. Oh, and something else that comes up with security that a lot of people don't know, again, going back to the host example, I may be using a host that's here in the US, but my information may be hosted off-site in a different country. Oftentimes it is. So a lot of US hosts, for example, were hosting their information in Ireland. Now there's some tax reasons around this too. Usually it's places with tax benefits, shall we say. I won't say shelters, but tax benefits that they would be hosting this information. But oftentimes, or what would come up sometimes, is these hosts would have information in countries that were sanctioned by the US, which can lead to a whole different situation. So also familiarize yourself with where your information is. I checked, and my information was actually being hosted in Ireland, and there were two other places that I was familiar with Ireland. I wasn't familiar with the two other places, and it can change. So knowing where your information is, or knowing where your clients, beneficiaries, donors, funders, contributors' information is also going to be really important, especially if someone asks you how you're protecting and keeping track of their information. So something to keep in mind, because a lot of people don't know that even if I use a host in the US, it's become more and more in the US now that it's become more and more that people will host information in the US because there was a big backlash. But for many years, information would be hosted off in other countries because it was cheaper, tax benefits, things like that. Or the data privacy laws were looser, was another reason. So people were getting really slick. Intellectual property. I bring this up in terms of technology because there's so many platforms that allow us to build websites and wiki pages and logos and microsites and all kinds of different information. What a lot of nonprofits don't think about, though, is who owns that information. So if I'm using a logo creator that's only charging me $30 to create a logo, oftentimes there's a reason why it's so cheap. And typically it's because what they're doing is they're taking a stock. Sometimes they've stolen it. I'm not saying all of them do, but I've seen this happen before where they maybe have used other logos as inspiration, which can get a little tricky. They'll create a stock and they create a bunch of different derivatives and shoot it out to you. So I may have a logo from that site that is very similar to a logo that someone else would have. And sometimes for more, they'll say, okay, we'll give you the copyright, or we'll give you rights, or whatever the case may be. But then that gets into who else has it and all these other different things. So anytime we're using technology to develop things, the intangibles that come from our head, we have to be thinking about things like ownership. We have to be thinking about things like right to use, where we don't have ownership. And so again, typically when I'm using a website, when I'm using a software as a service, SaaS, something online like the Vengage infographic developers, or Canva is another one that a lot of people are using. Adobe Spark is another big one. I don't own any of what I'm developing. I am only licensing it. And in those terms of use that they have posted, which can get thick, But in those terms of use, they'll have what my license is. I can do this, I can't do that, I can do this, I can't do that, or I can't say this. It's really important to understand what those limitations are. It's not to say that you will always find yourself in an enforcement action, but I don't want to run the risk. And so if I'm being told that I can't use what I've developed in a specific country or in a specific area or for specific uses, then it's important that I know that. If I am intending to have ownership, it's important that I understand whether or not I actually do have ownership. And can I keep others from being able to use whatever it is that I have created? It all, again, goes to expectation management as well. And then when I use things like Upwork or, well, freelancers, Upwork now, Fiverr, anything like that, so utilizing technology platforms to find people to develop things for me, what does that relationship look like? What do I own? What do I not own? Most of those platforms don't address things like that. I'm actually expected to do that myself with the freelancer. And so if I have a freelancer that's developing a speech for me and I'm expecting to own that speech, but I haven't discussed it technically so it gets tricky actually. If they were hired to create something, then it's considered a work made for hire in which you would own. It's better if you have that in writing because it's not always a slam dunk. What I have seen happen in the past, however, someone may have found a freelancer that has something existing that they really liked and said, hey, can you tweak that for us to use? The intention was for the nonprofit to then own what was tweaked, but technically it's a derivative of an existing copyright that freelancer already had, which means they owned it. Depending on how substantive the tweaks were, it may still be something that they own, which means they could always come back to me and say, hey, you need to take that down. I don't want that on your site anymore. So I say all this to say, it's not as cut and dry as people think. And this is probably one of the areas that I get most concerned when I'm working with my nonprofit clients, because very few of them ever look into intellectual property agreements, IP assignments. So once I have you develop my logo, are you assigning all your rights to me? Because again, it may not be that this was a work made for hire. So in case it's not, am I making absolutely certain that any rights you claim to have, you're giving over to me? And am I really clear if I don't own it on what I can do with it and what I can't do with it? Because I may end up owing you money or damages if I do something with intellectual property that I didn't own that you told me I could only use in specific ways. What else? This also came up for a lot of nonprofits. I don't know if any of you remember a few years ago where nonprofits would download photos off of Google and post them on their blogs. And then there was just this massive wave of trolls, is what they call them. That's not my term. Trolls were what they called, that went through and said, you downloaded that from my photo site. It's not for ownership. It was only licensed and there's royalties. And so I've seen impressions that amount to X. And so you owe me $3,000. And so I had clients that were getting demand letters that said they owned anywhere from $1,000 to one of them was $10,000 for the use of this photo that they didn't actually own. So thinking about things like that, anytime you have staff or, again, freelancers who are downloading content, using content, are you being guaranteed that they've gotten the rights to use that content? Or are they just downloading things off of free sites, assuming that it's free, when in fact it was royalty-based and you're going to end up owing money once you actually start using it? You're seeing this kind of calm down. There was a rash of cases on this, and it kind of went all over the map in terms of what people were owed. More often than not, it's settled out, which means organizations still ended up paying money that they didn't expect to pay for a photo that they probably didn't really care too much about. So if you have folks that are utilizing technology to develop deliverables for you, be certain that they're actually getting the rights to use what they're using, and then have them represent, it's called representations and warranties, represent and warrant to you that they actually did get the rights to use whatever it is that they said that they're using. I think and then it comes up with website creation, interface customizations. And so if I have one of these donor platforms, again, that somebody may be making a customization for me on, am I expecting to own that customization? Typically, if it's on a software as a service, it's just going to be licensed to me, which actually not only means do I not own that customization, but they can use that customization to attract other clients, which I may not care about, but I may care about. So thinking about all of this is going to be really important. It matters because it is being regulated again at that state, federal level, and even international. I'll never forget when one of my first legal jobs was working at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Houston, which is super cool. They're one of the biggest fine arts museums in the South. And there was a letter that we were wanting to use for one of the exhibits. And it turned out the author of the letter was Italian. So I was asked to do some copyright research on the letter to see if we could actually use it. Turns out, at least at that point in time, there was no right. I would have had to go to someone within the author's lineage to get their permission to use that letter. So even though that letter was written to whomever, this letter was from the 1700s or 1800s, I think it was. It was a pretty old letter. In the US, we tend to have expirations around copyright and things like that, and we don't really protect too much personal items. There's some state laws, but for the most part, this isn't something that's heavily regulated here in the US. But in Europe, it's absolutely heavily regulated. And so what I found is I'd have to go to the lineage, I'd have to get their permission, and there were some other hoops that we'd had to go through in order to use this letter that was hundreds of years old. So I bring that up to say that there, even if the US doesn't have a law, there may be laws based on the author or creator of whatever it is that you're using that may apply as well, that long arm again. So always be aware of that. And then other concerns to be thinking about, this goes back to who is creating it, who is the owner of it, who is having access to it, or who is giving me information. Oftentimes when we do our analysis of, do I have a risk here? Because usually I have clients reach out and say, Erin, is this illegal or do I have a risk here? I tell them, before getting super convoluted and trying to get very specific with what the causes of action may be, just think about the who, what, when, where, and why. Those basic questions, why may this be concerned? Is it that it's related to data? Is it that I've had a hack or it's a security issue? Often, if we can just think of these basic questions, it starts to get a clearer picture around what we need to be thinking about and what our next steps may be. So if I think I may have a security issue, okay, then I need to go to somebody who's adept in security and see if that's actually the case. If I'm collecting data from people who are in California, okay, I need to start looking into Californian law to see if I have a problem here. So it makes it a little easier for us to navigate some of the concerns if we think about the who, what, when, where, and why. Trade and export was something I didn't talk about too much because it's a whole different tricky situation. But so for example, when I'm drafting agreements and I have a client that's developing equipment, or I'm trying to think of that's a technology. So technology. So let's say that I am having some type of technological concept advanced developed for me, or someone is requesting that of me. There's often trade and export laws around what can and cannot be exported based on a lot of technical components. So there may be limitations to the type of software that I could take with me. So actually, I know a perfect example. I had, because it's so complex, I'm trying to think of an easy example. I was corporate for several years and managed the legal for multiple software entities. And there was one software that we had developed that had components that were not for military use, but they could have been. And you'd be surprised what's defined as something that could be for military use. But it was something that related vaguely to other technologies that could be used for military use. And my client, which is the company, that the salesperson got on the plane and I would think went to Abu Dhabi or Qatar, one of those places. It became problematic because that immediately was an export violation. We weren't supposed to be able to export that. And so there were all kinds of filings and licenses and things that we had to file. It's better to disclose those things. So there were things that we disclosed so that we wouldn't get in trouble down the line. But I say that to say, as you have technology developed or you're using technology, be thinking about travel too, because there's some limitations around what type of technology can and cannot travel, who can have access to it. So that was another issue that would come up when I was corporate, was we would have people visiting from other countries, and there were components in our software that, because these folks were from sanctioned countries, and if you want to know what a sanctioned country is, look on the OFAC list, OFAC, OFAC, I said OFAC, OFAC list. But there's a list of countries that are sanctioned for a number of reasons. And so when I would do training with these folks, there were certain people I couldn't have on our computers, and sometimes couldn't even be on the premises depending what the sanction was, because they were from these countries. And so some nonprofits, this is not going to be an issue, but I've had some international humanitarian nonprofits where this has become an issue, where they have to be thinking about where they take their software, where they're using software. I know when I traveled to Romania, I actually would be blocked from using a lot of websites because of all the hacking activity. So just there's different things to be thinking about as we globalize. And again, even if we're here in Texas or Nevada or wherever we may be, if we have folks coming from other countries, there may be limitation on the type of technology that they can develop and use and things like that. So it's a little bit more nuanced. And again, it's not going to apply to everyone, but there are some that I think that's going to be really important that they be thinking about. And then how is the technology being used? That goes back to there's some limitations around technology may or may not be regulated here, but if you start talking about humanitarian use or there's some type of military component, then it may be regulated over here. So just being aware of things like that is going to be really important. And then to that end, as you're collecting data, if you're talking about workarounds, only collect what you need to collect. Don't ask for people's blood type and, astrology signs if you don't need that information. I see a lot of nonprofits ask for information they absolutely don't need. And then when you ask them, why are you collecting this? They don't know. And it can be because someone else was collecting something similar. They say they want to get to know the demographic, which I get, but just know that the more information you collect, the more you're leaving yourself susceptible to more regulation, more security concerns, and more risk. Always, always, always update your technology. We were talking about this with Zoom. That is why you're seeing so much happen with Zoom with updates. Is because of some of the hacking and things that have been happening, the bombings that have been happening on Zoom. And so as you have websites and blogs and e-commerce sites, oftentimes those sites are going to create software packages to update the security aspects of what they're doing. You see this a lot with the WordPress will often have updates that are security specific because they're seeing a lot of hacks in a specific area around a specific workaround. If you download themes on certain blogs, I know that I've been remiss about this in the past and had to get better, was my themes. People would find little holes in it. And so the themes would actually update to the blogs that I had. And I would need to make sure that I kept those updated to keep the security up to date. Same with just your computer. Mac, I know because I have a Mac, is often making updates around security things they've seen come up. The reason this is important, again, is because when you go back to, if there is a hack, one of the things that people will be looking around is, did you use reasonable standards to keep the information secure? If you hadn't updated your computer in a year and you hadn't been updating your themes and you hadn't been updating your blog, that's definitely going to work against you. And you might start to see people claim that you owe them damages as a result of negligently maintaining their information. So make sure that you're up to date on all your technology. Use encryption any and everywhere that you can. All encryption is not created equal. So read up on it and better understand what some of the encryption standards are. There's a lot of sites that are really good for saying, oh, we use encryption, but they're not very specific on what that looks like or what parts are encrypted and how does information transfer? Does it transfer in a way that there may be a part that it isn't? All of that. So just being familiar and asking questions of your vendors is going to be really, really important. And create short policies. It doesn't have to be a Bible in terms of what policies look like, but have some short policies around who can use what technology. Does there need to be approvals? So, if there's a staff of 4, I may have some of the interns and things create microsites, but ultimately, do they need to run part of that through someone on staff just to make sure that they've got some of these things in place? And in the policy, you can actually have checkoffs. I've done that for clients where we've created just kind of this is what you need to be thinking about when you create a microsite. Check this off, that we thought about this and we've asked about that. We've gotten a copy of the protocol from the vendor or whatever the case may be. Having policies that talk about that is going to be really, really important. And as you gather information from things like this webinar and other webinars or downloads, keep that in a knowledge management platform. If you learn a little bit something about encryption, don't just keep that to yourself. Make sure that everybody knows about that. And then if you do find that there's an encryption standard that works best for the organization, that's when you might put that in the policy and say, hey, anytime we're creating this type of technology, we need to make certain that we have this encryption standard. I've helped a lot of organizations create IP policies. So again, if they're going out and hiring freelancers on Fiverr or whatever the case may be, we need to make sure that we have a contract in place would be one thing in the policy. This is what the contract needs to have. We need to make sure we have rights to do this. And I've had them range anywhere from 2 pages, which wasn't super thorough, but that's what they wanted, to 5 or 6 pages. So it can range in terms of how long it is. It doesn't have to be super complicated. But again, it makes sure that there's continuity. And even if it's just you, I don't have with me playbooks that I've created for myself so that I remember when I'm doing things, oh, you know what, I need to be keeping this in mind, or I need to make sure that I check this off and that I'm thinking about this and thinking about that. Because as we get going, sometimes we can forget about the different things that we need to have in place. And then workflows. It may just be rather than, or in addition to having policies, we have a workflow. So it starts with the intern, and then when we get to some of the more serious things around X, Y, and Z, it then goes to the staff person, and then we send everything to the CEO just to make sure that they're comfortable with it, and that's it. So there's a number of different things you can do to protect the organization, but just be thinking strategically about that. And then that's really it in terms of what I wanted to talk about. Victoria, if you felt like there's anything I didn't cover or questions that people might have, or if there were questions that people had, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Well, I'll pose a few just because I think some, especially those that I come into contact with, and some of the things I've actually done. I have a tendency to not take images, but create my own, like the logo for the Philanthropreneur. It's basically just text that I've did a multicolor platform and created our own. But yet we still went through a trademark process for that. And the whole trademark, and a lot of people, because I've asked a lot, should we trademark what we're doing? Some of them are so what I call common that I'm like, I don't think you'll get it for that. But the term philanthropreneur is rather unique. And we had to go through a long process because a German company was trying to get the US trademark from us.
Oh, wow.
And it really.
So they objected is what it sounds like when you made your filing?
No, they filed first. They had been.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they had been tracking. I had been using it in a radio show. I had a digital magazine, and had been using it, but it was under my old company, which was the Galaxy Group. It was just a philosophy I had created of philanthropy and entrepreneur, that you need to be both. Put that business into your nonprofit. And that's how it evolved. And one night the term philanthropreneur popped in my head, and I just started calling that philosophy the philanthropreneur model. Then made the show. And so I was, out of the blue, a internet marketing company called me and told me I was on a trajectory because I was getting a lot of tracking. People were tracking it. And it was a German company. And they actually had filed in Nevada for a nonprofit.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they were really looking at me because they did it in Nevada, and then they filed the US trademark for the term. Immediately found a lawyer really quick because I was shaking in my boots. No. I just thought I was getting ready to lose it. And fortunately, found a lawyer like within an hour or so, and he was pretty good, because he could explain everything to me, because I just thought I was done with.
No, that's something that people have to be thinking about. Like you said, it's not as worrisome as everyone thinks it is. However, most attorneys used to advise don't worry about it, especially when you were just getting started, because most organizations were too small, or the namesakes were just not unique enough to where you would. So I get that. And then I had my own best friend who had his entire, not only his name, but his entire business model was lifted and used for a startup competition in Austin or San Antonio, I think it was. And he was only 2 years old, I think, when that happened. And so someone saw the model and the name and said, okay, we're just going to duplicate all of this. And with the ease of globalization, it was easy to find him and what he was doing. And I guess they felt that because they were working with one of the biggie startups that I won't mention, that it wouldn't become problematic. And so that was kind of a learning lesson for all of us, was that it is it's often the things that we don't think about. Usually, hopefully, if you have an attorney that can walk you through exactly what you talked about, questions, what would your rights be? What is a good timing?
Yeah, and an attorney can actually go on the back end of the filing process. And just to answer Dr. Statton, all of Erin's information will be posted on the replay of this.
I wasn't looking at the chat.
Yeah, so we'll make sure that on our meetup group and on our Facebook group that Erin's contact information is there. So have no fear, you will get all of that.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining.
Yes. So he was more concerned about blocking them because it looked like they wanted to block me from using a term I had been using for years. Unfortunately, he said, well, it looks like they're they're not using an attorney to file. He said, because they had filed wrong. And he said, you have 72 hours. I was like, okay. So, but that actually was the birth of the Philanthropreneur Foundation, because it pushed me to come from underneath my business umbrella and to actually create it as its independent entity as the Philanthropreneur Foundation. And so got it filed, and we ended up getting the trademark because
yay!
We got it.
It's nice that it works. It's always nice when it works out that way.
Yeah, because they had to, their application was sent back to them for correction, but when they saw that we had gone ahead and filed, they never refiled. They never sent it back in. They just let us have. They knew they were going to get blocked, so or have a little trouble.
Yeah.
So
good deal.
Yeah, we ended up getting it about 8 months later. So that was just my story of the little things that you often don't think about that, you need to pay attention in terms of the legal side of what you're doing. Yes, ours was unique because of a unique name, but there's so many other, what I call bullet points of things that you need to pay attention. Today you were highlighting a lot, just the technology part of it, but there's elements throughout the whole process that if you set them up correctly in the beginning, you don't have to worry about them so much as you grow. You just have to tweak them and make sure that your growth and what you have set up is in alignment. And great information. What I was sitting here, you probably saw my bobble. I had the bobblehead because every time you would say something, I was like, yep, people need to know that. I'm definitely going to make sure that this is information is spread as far as it can go, because it is very valuable. I want to thank you for being a part of Tech for Good, our Las Vegas chapter meeting. If you could just tell everybody, so it's in the video itself, your contact information, and then I'll make sure I write it and have it in the narrative that we post.
Absolutely. So if you wanted to give me a call, it's 832-305-6417. And my email is erin@emcclarty, MCCLARTY, PLLC.com. And you can also visit the site. I have resources on this and some other things up on the site on the resource page, and that's emcclartypllc.com.
Yeah. Well, I love your nonprofit notations. You still do that, right?
I think I do. I'm getting ready to change the name because it's expanded out. For years, I've always been talking about business, and people don't realize I talk about impact businesses and things like that. But I'm still, I think year 10.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I've probably been following it for 6 or 7.
Oh, great. It's good to hear.
So once again, I want to thank you for being our guest here at Tech for Good Las Vegas chapter. And for now, we're going to say goodbye, and I am going to turn off this recording. Have a great day.
Thank you.